Today, I will be talking to you about the first movement of Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2. This concerto established Rachmaninoff's fame as a composer, particularly in the area of the concerto. This piece is fondly known by many and is still regarded as one of Rachmaninoff's best works, as well as one of the most esteemed concertos to date. But before I get into the composition, let's first talk a little bit about the composer himself. Sergei Rachmaninoff was born on April 1st of 1873 in Russia. He grew up in a musical family and took up piano at the age of 4. In his prime, Rachmaninoff stood at about 6 feet 6 inches, and his hands were so big that he could span 12 piano keys, which is about an octave and a half, or a perfect 12th on the piano. This directly influenced some of the expansive chord voicings he used in many of his piano works, and also caused some of his pieces to be incredibly difficult to perform for individuals with a less endowed hand size. This piano concerto was initially intended for performance in Rachmaninoff's London concert of 1899, but following the highly criticized premiere of his Symphony No. 1 in 1897, which is now seen as a significant achievement for Rachmaninoff, he suffered severe depression and a lack of self-confidence. It was during this time, between the autumn of 1900 and April of 1901, after working with physician Nikolai Dahl, Rachmaninoff composed his Piano Concerto No. 2, and subsequently dedicated the concerto to Dahl. Rachmaninoff completed the first movement of this concerto in 1901, despite the last two movements having already been composed and performed in 1900. The orchestration for this first movement is for 2 flutes, 2 oboes, 2 B-flat clarinets, 2 bassoons, 4 horns in F, 2 B-flat trumpets, 3 trombones, 2 of them tenor and 1 bass, and a tuba, as well as timpani, solo piano, and strings. Rachmaninoff uses sonata form for this first movement in C minor and begins with a solo piano introduction marked moderato. This introduction spans for 8 measures of somber chords rising from pianissimo to a vibrant fortissimo, and emulates a sort of bell tolling. The chords are primarily rooted on F with chromatic alterations to create a subdominant function and continue until the final beat of the introduction. In measure 11, the violins, violas, and clarinets state the first half of subject 1, while the piano provides an arpeggiated accompaniment. It is important to note that this first part of the first subject is a highly typical Rachmaninoff subject, having the melody revolve around a single tone. The second part of Subject 1 is stated in the cellos in measure 27, and they are later joined by the rest of the string section in measure 34. The phrase structure of this second part is less defined than that of part 1, though the whole subject is virtually one whole extended phrase. The melody rises sequentially to a climax in measure 42 on a secondary dominant and dynamic marking of fortissimo. In measure 55, the piano repeats and extends the original cello melody to an authentic cadence in measure 63 in C minor to mark the end of the first subject. The transition begins where one general harmonic functioning chord can be heard per measure, with groups of non-harmonic chord tones, but melodically functioning chords over the pedal point on C. You can hear a brief 4-measure introduction before the second subject begins in E-flat major, played by the solo piano. For this second subject, there are 3 distinct parts. The first, heard in measures 83 to 103, consist of 2 nearly identical periods, in which the last chord of the first period becomes the first chord of the second period. An authentic cadence in G minor, in measure 103, marks the second part, moving the tonality away from E flat major for a brief moment, but only lasts until measure 113, where the tonic of E flat major is clearly reestablished and marks the beginning of the third part to the second subject. All of the phrases in the second subject have irregular phrase structures, which contributes to the restless-like quality found in many of Rachmaninoff's works. The closing section begins in measure 125, with the oboes, clarinets, and then piano playing the following theme. The following rising melodic line can be considered the final part of the closing material before the opening motive from the first subject is repeated. After that, a chorale-like brass entrance in measure 151 transitions into the development section. In the development section, 5 distinct parts can be heard. The first begins with the first subject played in the oboes, clarinets, and violas. The second has both of the first and second subjects being stated by various instruments throughout the orchestra in sequence. A short motive from the second theme is then played sequentially in 4-bar phrases for the third part of the development. The fourth part of the development continues with the second subject, now played by the clarinets and violas, with an added syncopated rhythm in the piano. In measure 217 at the accelerando, the final part of the development, which can also be seen as a preparation for the recapitulation, begins. The second subject is played against quarter note triplets, creating tension, followed by 4 measures of dominance to emphasize the new key center for the recapitulation. With a dramatic entrance, the first subject is stated in C minor, identically phrased as in the exposition, with the piano rhythmically playing the first part of the development in extensive chords. A motive from the second subject can be heard within the chords played by the piano. The recapitulation continues with an identical structure to the exposition thus far, albeit some differences in instrumentation. This changes, however, in measure 291. Rachmaninoff uses the dominant 7th chord in measure 296 to change course. This same chord, heard in the exposition, previously led to the transition into the second subject, like so. In the recapitulation, however, Rachmaninoff distinctly chooses this chord to resolve deceptively to an A-flat chord in C minor, leaving out the transition altogether, and goes directly into the second subject, which appears at the moderato. This time, while the theme has been altered significantly in terms of rhythm, the second subject retains its irregular phrase structure. The closing material, beginning in measure 313, passes various motives from the second subject around the orchestra. The coda begins with a major 3 chord in first inversion to a 1 at the meno mosso tempo marking. The piano is highlighted with fast 16th note and 8-note runs over the rest of the orchestra before coming to a quick conclusion. Overall, the first movement has generally become the most popular in this 3-movement concerto. Motives from this movement can be referenced in novels, movies, and television shows, with certain motives even influencing more modern music like Frank Sinatra's 1945, Full Moon and Empty Arms, as well as his 1941, I Think of You, and the chorus to Space Dementia by Muse. To conclude, my first question is, why do you think this movement's motives and melodies have influenced and appeared in popular media so often? My second question is, in what ways does this first movement represent the timeless nature of Rachmaninoff's compositions? That will be all for me on this presentation. Thank you so much for watching.